By the by, for the last few tapings, I have mentioned a phrase that in my creation story, had I told it specifically, that I would have very likely pointed out that just after creation was created, that the delivery came about through triplets. 3 different forces, 3 different measurements, 3 different dimensions, and that they all were ignorant of their siblings. But all of you do understand that each dimension is aware of the fact that there are differing measurements going on, other dimensions. They just don't realize that they're all family. Be sure when I keep saying that they are ignorant and have no knowledge of the siblings. They certainly have knowledge that there are differing measurements, opposing dimensions, but none of them have any notion that they're kin, that the whole thing is family. Now, going back still some to the possibility that I presented to you of words, rather than being from a larger view, remember, rather than words being responsible solely, even primarily for the transfer of information, facts, data. My proposal to you is the possibility may always be in a process of preparation, that that's what talk is about. That talk is what humans do while awaiting their next assignment. And that can be just split second. Because that was not a joke, even though I did not, as of yet, pull that into any great discussion vis-a-vis the creation myth. But it's continually between assignments of what am I going to do next, rather than people stand around and eat too much chocolate or play pocket pool or pick their nose. People talk. So back to the purpose that I suggest to you, that the primary purpose of talk words may be simply the preparation for even more words, for even more experience. It is the future. It is an introduction. It is a warning. It is a softening, a preparation for the future. I was going to pick out, since I've hit and kicked at them in various ways in the past, some very everyday examples, but that go unnoticed. That is, in an expansive view, though they get noticed on this view, but a bigger view. 2 of our all-time favorites, I'll speak for everyone: economic and weather forecasting. As all of you know, in this great age of information, in this great part of the planet Earth, that we are up to our elbows in the information age, we're the leaders of the information age, more and more in all the print, the non-print media, devoted over to economists and weathermen, weather persons. But now listen, any, to ordinary level, any fairly well-read person knows for a fact that economists cannot predict the fiscal future. In general, they certainly cannot predict specifically any of the market activities, any of the markets activities. They simply cannot. And every now and then someone points it out. It just goes by. But anybody knows that. That's no secret. You don't have to sit down and reinvent the wheel or the fountain pen or the disposable diaper all over to try and sit down and plot out, well, all of the people. I'm going to pick out some economic newsletters. I'm going to pick out some media figure in economics, or someone in the world of academia that makes predictions, that comes on and does these little sound bites for the TV station. And I'm going to see how their predictions come along. Don't bother. People's already done that. Flipping a coin, going out and seeing whether a cow raises its tail or lowers its tail will tell you as much about the market and the weather, by the way, when we get to that, as the forecasters can. Anybody knows that. Anybody that reads at all and had even a modicum of memory knows that no one can predict the future, since man is the future. But They cannot, I'm sticking to some specifics to get you to see. You are in the print, on television, radio, their whole shows. But network news, local news, now has large segments devoted, not just to weather. The weather gets bigger and bigger in its segment. But now they almost, a tempo, have their own economist, or at least somebody from a local college or university that once a week, maybe once a night, shows up and makes some comment. And I mean, dead ahead, just like the weatherman does. He'll say, well, based upon today's activities, I don't think that I would seriously be opposed in me saying that the chances now of a recession in 1990 are just gone. And people go, yeah. And tomorrow he'll show up and they'll say, well, based upon the figures released by the housing department and the great drop in the building permits issued across the country, the prospects of a recession loom larger than ever. Now this is 24 hours later. This is not an attack on economists. Anybody knows that. But notice, people go right along and listen. People apparently will sit there and watch TV, or you'll see people reading the Wall Street Journal at breakfast, taking notes, looking very concerned, scratching their nose. When, if you said, do you realize, you do know that no one can predict what's going on with the market, much less the overall economy, to even say, well, there's going to be a recession this year, and the next day some other spokesman said there's not. You might as well flip a coin. And the guy would say, yeah, you're right. So notice what's going on. Or take weather forecasting, which I guess is even easier to see, that they'll have a man or a woman being paid good, big bucks, I understand, all dressed up, hairdo, toupee if necessary, suit, and of course spend, if he's got 5 minutes in the weather segment, he'll spend 4 minutes telling what has happened, which, well, everybody, give me a break. I'll speak for the weatherman to tell what did happen, like you needed somebody to tell you, well, today it rained, and to tell how much it rained and where it rained. But then the last part he'll say, and now here is of course now they're even better. It's not just the forecast, it's the 3-day forecast, or some of them that really like to walk on the wild side will give a 5-day forecast. And the man will look dead in the camera, and they'll flash up on the rear screen projector thing, and they'll say, tomorrow will be sunny in the high 70s, and tomorrow you get up and it's overcrowded and it's raining. Now, of course, if you're doing something important, you might remember it, but chances are you do not remember it. It's for sure the weatherman does not come back tomorrow and go, I'm so humiliated, I'm going to kill myself, I was so wrong. They cannot predict the weather. And that's a known fact. The weathermen know it, but now there are even offshoots of the so-called science of meteorology that more and more now has information to excuse. I don't mean in a negative sense, to explain why it is such a complex system that to predict the weather beyond, to tell the truth, they're not there yet, but I don't make this sound like it's some kind of supersonic inspiration I suddenly had. All of you should know this. It's almost impossible to predict the weather an hour from now. Things can happen, and they are more and more, as they call it, scientifically, with their statistics, beginning to plot out about how things happen that are so outside the bailiwick, the possibility of intellectually, technologically, with all their equipment, balloons, satellites, that things happen because it is so complex. I was not making inferences to their insanity. It's just that they say that things are so complex in the weather systems that one little change, one unexpected change can influence everything else. I was taking a little side trip to say, does that sound anything like the operations, the neural operations of this kind of system? But back to where I was saying. They cannot do it. And yet people sit there and look at it. TV, radio, newspapers devote large segments of their energy, that is, their words, related to weather forecasting when anybody, your memory only has to be 24 hours, or maybe even 2 or 3 hours, If you had some reason to remember it, like you're going to get all dressed up and go outside and wash your car or wash the dog or wash your wife, and it rains, you might have occasion to remember an hour ago they said it was going to be clear. But at the very least, if your memory lasts for 24 hours, you know that weather forecasting, if you're crude, is a joke. So what's going on? Now, I picked those two to show you a prime example that you're faced with every day, wherein what purports to be the forecasting, the information given. It's not just guesses, they present as information. The meteorologists can go into about how their high pressure system's here and there's such and such going on and how they will converge over the southeastern part of the United States and the jet stream is now moving north and it's going to push. Economists can say, well, based upon the leading indicators of the gross national product and our imbalance of trade, based and in conjunction with, here's the key point, in conjunction with the figures released today by the Commerce Department showing housing down, that specifically shows, and then they go, it sounds as though it's not just a guess. The man is fixing to say it now shows that you can expect, I'm telling you, you can expect the prime interest to go up and you can expect a recession before the third quarter of 1990. And tomorrow he may say something just completely different. But he says that, and it's not given as a cheap opinion, because already the man's got credentials. Somewhere along the line they've listed his credentials. The man has been educated. So he knows something. He presents it as facts. But now remember, anybody that's well-read at all, will include everyone here and on tape, and can remember from one day to the next, knows that no economist, or of course no anyone, but I'm taking experts, no economist can predict the fiscal future. They cannot. But does anybody notice? Does anybody care? Why not? The information is flawed, to say the least. The information is just absolutely undependable. Just like weather forecasting. And it continues. It grows. It becomes more and more important, evidently. And it's no more reliable. So what's going on? You find ordinarily, apparently intelligent people faithfully, let's jump back to matters of the economy, faithfully considering, reading, pondering, making notes, these attempts passing for news. When, if they were questioned, if they questioned themselves, is this actually news? That is this facts? Is this information? And it's not. But they react to it. Would you consider under those two primo examples that the apparent question of actual information or facts being transferred from one source to another, one person to another, one system to another, is meaningless? Because I've just pointed out to you a known fact that anybody can recognize for a split second, that no one, from expert to your brother-in-law, can predict financial futures. No one can predict the weather. They can't do it for one day. Does that stop anybody? So if it's faulty, if it's inconclusive, if it's undependable, then what is the purpose? What if the primary purpose of words is not in the apparent transfer of information, but is simply in the energy, and the continuing energy, since everything is a preface to something else, that the energy simply prepares you for upcoming energy. That it fills in the time, whether it be a split second, a minute, an hour, between you getting your next assignment. And your next assignment is, well, what'll I think next? You're staying around, there's nothing to do. You're staying at a bus stop, and a stranger walks up, and down somewhere below the limbic system, you kind of get nervous. Maybe the person goes, pretty hot today. And you go, yep, I heard on the news it was going to rain and cool off later. If I jumped out of the bushes, or the guy jumped out of his own Euro bushes, well, let's say that I did, and I said, why are you telling this guy that you heard on the radio that it's going to rain and cool off today? Do you think that anybody, how old are you? The man says, 45. Do you read the paper? Yes. Do you listen to radio news? Constantly. Do you know that weather predictions are not good 5 minutes maybe? And he goes, yeah, you're right. And I said, well, why are you telling this guy that you heard it's going to rain and cool things off? Do you believe that based upon your experience? Based on your experience, you look reasonable. You're intelligent and sophisticated as much as an average person. You go, yeah. Do you believe that? Is that reliable? No. Well, why'd you say it? All right, we're getting into the area. Now, if we were back instead of a more complex view to a small one, I guess some psychologists could say, well, that's chit-chat. That's a kind of lubrication that civilized people do verbally with one another, and I know all that. I could have said that. I just did. But there's some reason. What I'm pointing out, notice, it keeps the hobby of human conversation. It keeps the lapse that there you stand, back to where I started the example. And it's like neurally, there you stand and you're doing something, who knows what. I'm going to jump in the middle of your act. And you're staying there until this other guy walks up. And you become sort of nervous. Look at it then as you're between assignments. You don't know what to do. The guy walks up and you don't have your next assignment. That is, you don't know whether to turn around and look at him dead in the eye and maybe it's frighten him, or to turn around and look dead at him to see whether he is making some sort of threatening gestures or something, or whether you should be prepared to run for it, or whether you're just going to stand there and you're uncomfortable. I'm just going to use everyday terminology, and you don't know what to think. You were daydreaming about, who knows what, the weekend and going out and having fun, until suddenly you're aware this figure walks up. You're there by yourself, traffic's flying by, nobody's bothering you, it's nice and warm, and this figure comes up. And it's like you're between assignments. That is, you don't know what to think. On a lower level, you don't know what to feel. And so you don't know what to do. And so what do? You're between assignments. You talk. And what do you talk about? In this case, I picked out the weather. Or the other guy seemed to have done it. When the information going of you, after he mentions about hot, isn't it? And you still don't particularly have your real assignment. You don't know, is he just making small talk to throw me off so that as soon as I relax, he's going to jam a knife in my ribs and steal all my money? Is he an idiot? Is he fixing to start on some kind of crap about, yes, ever since we've sent up spaceships, the weather's gone berserk, and I know that God's trying to get even with us plus NASA's run by a bunch of communists and Episcopalians. And so you don't know what to do. You're between assignments, and he mentions the weather. Hot, isn't it? The hobby of talk now has a specific connection to this faulty, on one level, so-called discipline, science of meteorology. That you say, yes, I heard it's going to rain and cool it off later, when you know that that's unreliable. Instead of me just saying unreliable, you all know what I'm saying by now, that is not real information. You're not telling him real information. What you heard this meteorologist that has credentials and education, what he told you that's going to rain later this afternoon and cool things off, that's not information. And don't say it's a guess. It's not even that. That's not even the purpose. But notice now you have something to do between assignments. You and this guy can talk. Not on the basis this is true, this is going to happen, there's information. Between assignments, humans talk. That's part of the purpose of talk. It's to take up that little gap. Insofar as what you talk about, I keep suggesting to you for the last few tapings, is meaningless. At a lower level it could be meaningful. That if he does stick a knife in your ribs and say, give me all your money, you can call that meaningful at that level. You can call him saying, hot, isn't it? You can call that meaningful. Like, what is he talking? What does he mean, hot? Was he saying that in a hostile manner? Is he trying to entice me into some kind of foolish conversation? And he's going, you could look at, let's stay with the weather just a second, these kind of useless forecasts. You understand what I mean by useless? That is, they may be true. You can flip a coin and guess. But what the guy says, the weather forecaster, what he says may be true tomorrow. Maybe. but you cannot call it information. You cannot call it facts. So even though the information is probably incorrect, you need to see that it is pertinent to the overall movement of energy. Whatever, if we could spatially, just try and picture right quick, take the whole immediate structure and system of meteorology in all of its aspects, into the government, into private areas, into the media, and we called it this. If we said, hey, if some of you had the power and said meteorology and weather forecasting is a joke, we're not any better at doing it now than we were 100 years ago. The only thing we're better at now is realizing why we can't do it. So let's take that and just throw it out. It's just silly for civilized people to do that. You do understand someone would have to take that place if you could do that. If you could muck about with life and you had the power to pluck that out, something would have to take its place. And if you were the sort, if you were the one who did it and said, well, I'm doing away with the whole, everything connected with meteorology and weather forecasting because it's useless. It is not factual. It's got no place in the 20th century, much less the 21st century of intelligent people. It's almost witchcraft. It's just blind guessing, so you could throw it out. What am I going to make up for you? Something else would fill it up that from your view, if you were the one that had the view I just said, it would be filled up with something equally as inconclusive, unstable, unreliable. Same thing. It is not the weather forecasting per se. It is the transfer, the overall transfer of energy. And this is just one area that I thought some of you should be able to see quite clearly. It's not open season on attacking people trying to forecast the weather or economic futures. It is for you to see that anybody knows, given just a few seconds, and ask the right question, if I did it or if they did it to themselves, they know that these two areas, as much interest, as much energy is expended, and even money expended on them, that they are not factual. It is not a matter of fact. It is not a matter of real information, because that's not even the point. A little more, as long as I'm here, I can throw in kind of a subtext to this is not just the financial forecasting, is now in the media, and of course newspapers, television, they have some of the stations now, and the networks have their own financial expert, not just a forecaster, but a guy who gives information on personal financial planning. And it usually goes along with when they're pointing out, well, there is no doubt based upon the drop in private home construction in the first 2 quarters, there's no doubt the prime rate's going to go up. And so if you've got your money in money market accounts, if you've got your money in savings, they start giving what seems to be pertinent information about what the individual investor, and they'll look right in the TV camera, that you people at home. And imagine there are people at home, just ordinary John Q. and Susie Q. public, listening to this and not taking notes. When, again, if I could get in their brain and get their attention just for a second and said, what possible effect do you even imagine that you can have on the rolling thunder, the march of the financial life of man? Do you imagine that anything you do is going to have any effect? And in a lucid moment, everybody go, well, no. And yet they listen to this. They listen to dire predictions especially. They moan, shake their head, take notes, discuss it with their friends, as though their interest is going to have some effect. But the effect, the purpose is being served by them moaning, thinking about it, and discussing it with their friends. It is the overall general movement of energy on a even more specific level than just what seems to be the planning that these spokesmen for life note about the individual person vis-a-vis the overall projected movement of the economy. If it gets down to personal levels, real personal, they start giving advice about here's the important thing you should do, based upon what is happening now in the first quarter, all of you people who have your money in a closed-in mutual fund that's paying less than blank 0.5%, you should immediately, assuming it's not going to cost over 2% in a transfer fund, are you getting this? Yeah. You should immediately move this into something. Don't go over 6 months. It'd be better 3 months. Go into a government security, a Fannie Mae or a T-bill, and then next quarter transfer it back out, because I believe, if you'll watch, that the prime rate will be down such that the money markets will then be back to a competitive degree, and somebody's writing all this down, and their investment amounts to $1,700. This is not laughing at them, but notice. And if I ask them, or if they ask themselves, like, what difference is if you go all this trouble and drive down to the bank and you do all this, or you call your broker and you transfer this $1,700 from here to there, and the guy's right, what he tells you, let's assume just for once he's right. In 6 months, how much more interest will you have made than if you just left it where it was? And if a guy had a computer and he figured it's like 78 cents. Anybody with any intelligence, if I ask them that, knows that. And yet, surely you hear, I'm not going to stay with this much longer. It's not an attack. It is not sarcasm. It's not laughing at the folly of man. I'm pointing out, though, that what appears to be of importance. And if you ask people, what's important in life besides money? And most people nowadays say, well, not much else. That is important. And so it says, well, do you think it's worthwhile? The local stations especially, much less your local paper. The local station now, 3 times a week, has a financial advisor. And the man gives you, he keeps up. That's his life. And he keeps up with telling you, the individual investor, what you should be doing. And you think, yes, it is. I need all the help I can. I don't have time for that. I'm making a living, but I do have some money put away. I want to send my kids to college. Someday I want to buy a little lake house for me and the little woman. I need to retire. And so this kind of information is important. And you say, well, how much money in all of your investments, stock market, money market, government securities, savings, passbook, how much do you have altogether? And the guy thinks, and he says, $1,700. Well, it could be $6,000 nowadays, $12,000. And for him to go through all of this and to transfer it over, to call, to drive down to the bank, to go over to a brokerage within 6 months. If I jump from $1,700, it might go, if he had $6,000 or $10,000, the difference would be what when the year is out? $120 maybe. People go out nowadays, I assume you people, I'll read about it, I don't want to think about it. If people go out, 1 or maybe 2 people, and have, they don't call it supper anymore, do they? Dinner. Dinner at a nice place, and somebody comes up and hands them a bill for $120, and they sit there and ate it. So the point is, if I said, well, is $120 worth much to you? And the guy goes, no. So what's going on? The apparent facts. That is, well, I'm going to take notes from what that guy's telling me. I will transfer because he's right. That's true. The prime rate is going up. I heard that on the news. And so if he's correct, and if I transfer it now to here and I put it over there, and the rate does go up, hey, that will be to my advantage. It may be. And if you go through all that trouble and drive around and spend whatever the time is for $120, and the guy would say, well, you're right. That's not really any useful information. But notice, the world is full of people taking notes, watching the tickers run by. What is it? It is the movement of energy. It is the preparation for the future. But insofar as it having some pertinence right now individually, it has none. And I'm picking out 2 examples that you can get people, intelligent people, for a second. Of course, I wouldn't want to put it that broad to them, like, well, none of this has any significance, because that would certainly give ordinary people a severe case of the blues. So I wouldn't do that. But if I said, as I've done to you, about the weather, about financial forecasting and planning, if I said, is this actual facts? Is this useful information? You say it is. They say it is. But is it? And for a split second, just quite sane people with no interest in this kind of stuff will go, nah, you're right. Even if the guy's correct and I do go to all that effort, when the year's over, I'm going to make less additional interest than I'll go out and spend just like that on a meal. I'll sit up around the drinks after work and I'll spend that much. Yeah. But what's going on? What appears to be going on is not the point. It never is. But then ordinary people, as you're supposed to, are entangled in that, and when it seems to give a wrong kind of jerk, when energy that life needs flows in a way that seems to be regressive or adversarial to you, then people do begin to complain, and they take this personally. They'll begin to rail out at the government. They'll begin to believe that the Federal Reserve is some kind of communist plot. They'll begin to think that the weather is turning ugly on us because the gods or the environment's mad because of us eating out of plastic styrofoam. They begin to take this stuff seriously, as they're supposed to, when they know that it has no individual significance, or put the other way, there is nothing that they individually can even imagine that they're going to do. But does that stop it? No, it's not supposed to, because it's not silly, it's not foolish. Sometimes I call it a hobby, sometimes I refer to it as secondary activities, but it is the necessary, continuing movement of energy going on. If I had specifically given you my new creation story, my new creation myth, I want to tell you something else. Maybe if I keep telling you what I might have told you, maybe does anybody hope that someday that I'll actually tell the whole story? Or has anybody thought, well, wait a minute, he's telling it just piece by piece and threatening about what he might have done, so maybe I'll put it all together. Right. That's known as send me a card if you get work. If I had told you my new creation myth, then I was going to suggest another possibility. That right after, immediately after the birth of reality, would have come something else. Let's be dramatic. It's right after the creation of reality, then quite possibly my story would have then noted, just right after creation, reality was created, would come the wars. It's not noted in other stories. There's a crude version I'll mention in a minute. But almost immediately, and I'm not going into what kind of time frame would have been involved, but almost immediately after reality was created came the wars. The wars being the struggle between all dimensions and all measurements. The wars. Now, sort of as an aside, but it is worthwhile. You can do something with it. This is, it's never been mentioned this way, but still the reality is there. I just put a name on it. This has been the source of religion's brittle myths, dead stories of the war. Now, all religions have the war. But now let me tell you, sometimes an S, sometimes the plural, can make all the difference in the world. All the difference in the universe. All the difference in reality. Ordinary religions, without exception, all have their own very brittle, dried up, probably now sponsored by Sunkist, this brittle myth of the war. That is a conflict between two dimensions. A meaningless myth. Indeed, a meaningless conflict, if that's what it was. Because if you've got a conflict that was supposedly had some kind of cosmic significance and it only had two combatants, give me a break. What kind of big deal is that? For one thing, it's going to be over shortly. One side's going to trounce the other, and if it was this kind of cosmic warfare, in one dimension, or one force, one army. You got two, and one of them gets the other one into a position of submission. Now, we're not talking about France fooling around with Germany, or the rest of Europe fooling around with Germany time after time, and Germany says, hey, I give, and they think, okay, you won't do it again. Germany says, no, and they walk off and forget it. And then Germany, of course, does it again, to use one example. It's not that. We're talking about now forces that religions say are universal, eternal, cosmic in nature. And so you're not talking about some kind of conflict between the old Habsburg Empire and the new German states. You're talking about now eternity. And so, if it was only two combatants, if one of them got the other one down, that'd be the end of it. Because they wouldn't give them a chance. They wouldn't send them some money and let me help you rebuild. You really give up? The second force that's down goes, yeah, I do. And you're not going to try this again? No, I won't. Well, here, let me help you up. When he reached down to help him up, he'd pull him down and be bad news. That's why I'm saying that kind of the war, a singular conflict with only two combatants, two forces, of course, you know it's generally referred to as good and evil. That is a meaningless myth. It would be indeed if it were true. It would be a meaningless conflict because it would be over very quickly. As soon as one side was down once, that'd be it. There'd be no second chance because the triumphant force, if that's all it was the two combatants, and it was of supreme cosmic significance, and they knew it. Then the triumphant force, even if it appeared to be temporary, and one of them saying, wait, give me a break. I give. You know, I can't fight anymore. The one that apparently was about to triumph say, are you sure? The other force would go, yeah. And so he would take that chance to execute the supreme, once and for all, coup de grace. It would be, really? You can't move. You're really, boy, I'm tired. And he'd say, well, wait right here. And maybe the one that's down is holding up his arm like, you know, you're going to help me. And he'd find a good big rock or gun, something, and he'd put an end to it. It's the wars, not a war. You've got no war. If you're talking about the three great dimensions of like height, sea force, and the Gumbolini family, you've got to have all dimensions. You've got to have all forces. You've got to have all measurements continually in conflict. That's when you've got the wars, not the war. That's why the war can't be explained, all the way from philosophically to theologically. Nobody can deal with it. Of course, it's a great first story because it's unsatisfying. But at the ordinary level, as soon as things are not going right and someone says, gee whiz, why do things go like this? And suddenly, somebody that life is dressed up in some kind of funny suit, like a priest or a rabbi or some kind of philosopher, some of them wear funny clothes, jumps out and says, well, you have this struggle going on between good and evil. Of course, somebody could say, well, I don't really believe in that. And you can say, well, between humane, enlightened behavior and that which is still regressive and pretty barbaric, even in civilized milieus. They got to go, all right, I can dig that. And so the philosopher or the priest says, well, what's happened is a temporary triumph, or at least this one round seems to be won by the bad guys. But it's up to us good people to even make renewed effort to keep this from becoming a permanent state of affairs. And the guy goes, well, I like that. That explains, it's not my fault. That just sometimes there is this war going on between good and evil, decency and indecency, propriety and impropriety. And so it's, as you might expect, I mean, even if you had a boxing match and you had somebody the size of, Dick Butkus fighting Pee Wee Herman, if it went on for a while, Pee Wee would get in one or two licks, right? Let's assume that Pee Wee was the bad guy and Butkus was the good guy. So if you just peeped in just for a second at this fight going on, as much as you, when you heard about it, went, hey, this is no contest. At any given moment, for a split second, if you just went, boom, you might see Pee Wee give him one. And you would think, wait a minute, the bad guys are winning. And it's not even possible because the bad guy's a little 90-pound squirt. If it's the war, the boxing match, the conflict, and it's only got two combatants, two forces, it's always inconclusive. It will never be finished. And therefore, that is what makes, in case you hadn't put it together the last few tapings, that is the prime ingredient of the first story. The first story has to strike you as awe, but it has to be inconclusive. That is, if you took people who went, oh, okay, and I jumped out and I said, of course they'd say, why do you keep jumping out at me? But if I jumped out and he'd say, you're the guy that was asking me about weather forecasting and my financial affairs. I go, yeah, it was me. But let me ask you one more thing. This first story that you just heard, this religious story about the battle between good and evil, or this story you heard, this philosophical story, or this psychological story if you're not religious, about how there are humane, civilized tendencies always growing in man, and yet there are some regressive tendencies that in our lower parts of our brains and our nervous system we still have certain reptilian, certain animalistic urges that sometimes come out with some people. So whatever the story was, you're still talking about the two combatants. If I jumped out and I said, the story you just heard to help explain this stroke of bad luck you just had, financial affairs are run amok, your family's sick, your wife died, terrible things going on, in the story you just heard, this religious story you just heard, this philosophical story you just heard, this psychological story you just heard, this sociological story you just heard, and you went, oh, well, and you said you felt better. Right? I could sort of look at your face and you went, oh, like you felt better. And you went, yeah, I did. It kind of helped me to get through this because I thought, well, I'd never thought about it that way. And I went, yeah. And that's all right. That's what I call first story. That life does this. It's like life comes over and it kicks you in the shin. Not being negative, we've got to make it fast and picturesque. Life kicks you in the shin and you go, oh, like you lost your business, your family died, and life kicks you and you go, oh, and then life says, hey, that kind of thing happens, and of course it might say, plus, I only do that. That kind of thing only happens to somebody that has a great future in store. That only happens to people that's going to win the lottery next week. Anyway, life always has a story, and so I'd ask the guy, that first story you just took, yeah? It did make you feel better, yeah? When I thought about it that way, I do. If he would go a little bit further, even an ordinary person, the same way I was doing about finances and weather, a little bit further, and say, do you understand that first story? It makes Swiss cheese look like a brick. This story is just absolutely inconclusive, irrational, meaningless. And if you take any first story and push it, if you think about it more than you have to, which the first story is to just really think about it more than you have to, of course. Just a little bit, the guy would have to go, ooh. In other words, the first story really is serving no specific purpose to me. The information the first story gave, like, somebody's cheated me. Let's say the guy is still wired to be religious. And a priest jumps out. Life gives the first story that, well, even to good people, some bad things happen in mortal life, but in eternity, the myths, will do justice, and your enemies will get paid back. And so a religious person hears that and goes, huh. So again, if I jumped out again, he went, oh, not you again, and I ain't got time for that. And I said, all right, does that make you feel better? And he'd go, yeah, it does. And if I said, well, think about it a second. Why does that make you feel better? What's that got to do with your personal existence? That they're talking about eternity. Can you even picture eternity? No. Can you picture God? No. You got any feeling for a God? You know what he looks like? You ever? No. Well, what is this that in eternity, which you said you can't even conceive of, that God, which you say you can't conceive of, will get even with your enemies? I mean, even taking into account that you can't conceive of eternity and God, all right, let's ignore that. Why is it you think you're so important that God's going to keep track of every little person that insulted you and go to all the trouble to get even? In other words, you surely see, there is no way that ordinary intelligence, sophisticated intelligence can take any first story and think about it more than you have to and not realize this is meaningless. That is the whole purpose of a first story. It's got to be inconclusive. But it appears to be otherwise, because what it does is you're between assignments and life talks to you. Sometimes you think you're talking to you, and you go, oh. It's like between assignments that life comes up and suddenly, of course, life has somebody else, of course, always do it. Either some other person or your own nervous system. Life comes up and says, oh, by the way, you're fired. So it's the end of one assignment, like, by the way, you just lost your business. You could be fired sociably. Life suddenly says, oh, by the way, your wife and children just died in a car wreck. You're between assignments. Now, this could prove fatal. And, of course, some people do go to pieces. That is the end of them as a useful, they commit suicide. Let's make it easy. But the mainstream, this kind of thing happens to people between assignments, whether it be that huge or whether it just be some guy standing at a bus stop and a stranger come up and stands too close. So it can be apparently rather mild, or it can be pretty strong, like losing your business or your family. And so you're between assignments. That is, you don't know what to think. You just suddenly heard you lost your business. It's just gone. You're finished. So what does life do? There you stand, and you're on a precipice. You could intellectually go to pieces, fall over. Life could lose you. It's a little chip. It's a little transistor. Life immediately gives you your first story. Blah, 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 blah. Oh. But then, if I jumped out after life did that and said, wait a minute, I know you had bad news. I hate to make it worse, but that story you just heard about blah, 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 religious, psychological, whatever it was, and go, yeah. Just for an experiment, would you like to think about that story just a little bit more? Of course, that'd be a dirty trick if I could do it, because the purpose of the first story seemed to have served that he went, oh, like, well, I feel a little bit better that the talk is filling in between assignments. That, where am I going to go now that I just found my business is gone, or now I just found my whole family is wiped out in a split second? First story is a kind of talk to hold together, to keep some kind of sane cohesiveness between assignments. But if I start, think right past that first story. It was like demands, I'll make it crude if you can't hear me. Somebody gets bad news. It's the end of an assignment. Their assignment had been that I had such and such business. I had the A&J accordion repair service. And suddenly somebody just told me, hey, that whole building blew up. Oh, and you're the guy that had your insurance? The company's out of business. And so you're between assignments. You were the owner, the proud proprietor of A&A accordion repair service. Or you find your family just died. Your assignment was, I am the husband of so-and-so and the father of these kids, and you just find that my assignment's over, and so let's say you're about to cry, which you should, if you're ordinary. And life comes up and says, and it gives you some story. It sings a hymn in your ear. It has a priest say, there. They talk to you about eternity. Or somebody pops up and says, wait a minute, you can get a government loan and open up a small business loan and open up a new business. Some first story comes up, and so you're about to go to pieces, and life gives you the first story. You're about to cry, and you go, well, I mean, you're still a little shaky, but the first story, and then I pop up and say, wait a minute, think past that first story. And so you go through like this, that here you are, you're in business, you got a family, and you're in this position. Then you find out your business exploded, your family's dead, so you've lost that assignment. And you're going to pieces, and then you get a first story, and you go from there to back fairly calm. And then I say, think past that, and you think past it, and you're back to this. Do you understand? It would ruin first story. But if anybody could and wanted to think past first story, no first story is ever conclusive. That's why it's a first story. That's why it seems to be satisfying to some degree. That, oh, okay. That, in other words, things are not as bad as I thought, if that's true. If I will meet my loved ones in paradise. If the gods will get even with the guy that burned down my business and all those nice accordions I had there I was working on. Maybe it's a bad example. Personal opinion should not enter into this. In fact, I have an autographed picture of Art Van Dam in my... Look it up. Man used to win downbeat poles on an accordion. Of course, that's back before men were truly civilized, at least in their musical taste. Let me take this just a little bit further. For your consideration, would you consider this proposal in line with that? That the wars, remember we're talking about the wars, not the war, not some cockamamie, crude conflict between two forces, whatever they are, because the two forces are first story. Anytime you got the imagined conflict between two of anything, you got an inconclusive story. So the wars. Now the wars, apparently external and internal, because the wars are not just out there, the wars are in here. What if I proposed to you that the wars, both internal and external, is the necessary, never-ending, inconclusive activity without which man would not have a personality? Man would have no sense of individuality. I'll wrap it up temporarily. I'll give you a sentence. I'll give you another fantastic physics law. The conflict is I. Not me, is I. That's the wars. Down at earth level, you look at it, wars, and what do you get? Lots of smoke, noise, random violence, cries, moans, cacophony of weird sounds. But when you get into a more complex reality, the wars produce you. Not physically, not just the limbic you, not just the motor system you, this you. The you that talks, the part of the nervous system known as the intellect. Without the activity of the wars, both out there apparently and in here, there would be no individual sense of personality. There would be no individual sense of I. I is the wars. I is a three-dimensional manifestation of the wars. Any of you that want a real aside, could you consider this? The wars might be the ancestors of even the gods. As some of you like to say, if you could see that through a real big hole, that would explain a lot to the power of, I'd say, about 7. Just let me give you a corollary right quick. I threw this out in passing and it didn't seem to have much effect, so I'm going to repeat. Here was the theorem, law, idea, map, sketch, and that is, without spies and traitors, the wars could not continue. Now I threw that out 4 or 5 tapings ago, I guess, and now it should make a little more sense. If not, I'm going to try to make it more sense in the remaining 3 hours we have here on the tape. Without spies and traitors, the wars could not continue. Now let me tell you what spies and traitors are. Or I'll put it to you another way. All of your uncertainties, all of your ambiguities, all of your broken resolutions, all of your self-inflicted wounds are unrecognized reflections of the necessity of inner neural spies and traitors. But psychologically, they're called all kinds of other things. And I was kind of using psychological terms there, as I assume you noticed when I said self-inflicted wounds. All the way, I gave you a whole spectrum, all the way from uncertainties. And there is no uncertainty of any, it's not primary. It's illusionary if you think there's any uncertainty below the level of the human brain. Down in the limbic system, if you could separate it, down in just the physical being, the motor activity, the sexual, the whole operations of the body, could we separate it from the operations of the intellect and you still be more or less a human? There would be no uncertainty. All matters of uncertainty are here. There's no uncertainty with lions and jackals. There's no uncertainty. There would be no uncertainty in you, the organism, if you did not have this upper end of the nervous system functioning in the brain, the human mind, the intellect. With that comes, and I start off from one end to the other, three-dimensionally, uncertainties, ambiguities, broken resolutions, all the promises of what you're going to do. I'm going to quit drinking. I'm going to quit smoking. I'm going to get more exercise. I'm going to cut down cholesterol. I'm going to get more cholesterol this week, whatever it is. And then all the way up to what would normally be referred to as self-defeating behavior, self-inflicted wounds, doing things that from any angle, that once you stop for a second and you were still reasonably intelligent, every other second, let's say, that you think, God damn, why do I do that? Why do I keep getting drunk and breaking my car? Why do I keep getting attracted to women that hold me down and beat me up and make me love it and then later I regret it? Why do I keep investing in schemes and I lose money, and as soon as I realize I've been had, I go, I knew it, I knew it. Why did I do that? And of course, ordinary people looking through this size hole, they'd say, well, it's some kind of subconscious playing out of you wanting to suffer because you hated your mother and you always wanted to kill her, and now you're defeating yourself and you're trying to torture yourself. Consider it another way, from a larger view, that all of these that seem to be psychological, that seem to be operations that of questionable value at the very least, of all the uncertainties. Why can't I decide what to think? Why can't I decide whether to change jobs or leave my wife and go get another wife? All the way from ambiguities that sometimes I say, yes, I love such and such person. But then again, 2 minutes later, I hate the person. Or why does I keep making resolutions? I know what's best for me, and I make resolutions that there's no doubt I should quit drinking. I should quit taking cocaine. It's not in question, so I'm going to stop. You get up the next morning, and your nose is all white, and your pockets turned inside and out, and you're looking for some more coke, and you think, why did I do that? I'm simply hurting myself, self-inflicted wounds. All of these, they're unrecognized, they're unnoted in the way in which I'm describing them, but they are absolute reflections of the inescapable necessity that inside your own wars, that there be traitors and spies. And that's what this amounts to, except it's taken as being some kind of psychological, unconscious playing out of past traumas and hurts. Let me start the paragraph again. Without spies and traitors, the wars could not continue. And you got spies and you got traitors, but they're called other things. They're looked at as being subject to obliteration, certainly capture, except nobody can. Psychiatry can't do it, religion can't do it, and again, nobody seems to notice. It's the same thing as weather predicting, financial forecasting. If you did not have the internal, inside your internal wars, if you did not have spies and traitors, your wars could not continue. And without the wars, you would not function. You could not operate with the sensation of being a separate army, of you being your own entity, of you being your own expeditionary force of I. And yet people believe that there is something at the ordinary level, they're supposed to, that there is, the first story is given, that all of these ambiguities I have, all the uncertainties I have, all the things I do that from certain views are self-inflicted wounds, self-defeating behavior, they should stop. And nobody notices it never stops. It's never stopped in humanity. And nobody's ever said, they're not supposed to, but nobody's ever said, wait a minute, maybe we're looking at this wrong. How about on a simple level? Maybe we should just change the description. Maybe we're describing it incorrectly. Nah, come on, give me a break. Chill out, people. You couldn't do that. No, you can. Wait a minute. Just change the description? Nah. Forget I said that.